If Andrea and Russell had been left to their own devices without the influences of an insane cult, well, Andrea would still have been debilitatingly mentally ill, but 5 children would not have their names on gravestones today. This is the story of Andrea Yates, the mother who killed her own 5 children after being hounded by the cult's demons for 7 years. This is going to be a tough one to listen to, full of dead children, demons in the walls, and a woman in the middle of it all, at the mercy of her unhinged mind, while everyone stood by and did nothing to stop the inevitable. Strap in, and let's get into it. Andrea was a valedictorian, swim team captain, and devout to her faith. Russell Yates was devout, a NASA engineer, and he too was very religious. When he laid eyes on the 25-year-old nurse, he was smitten, and so was Andrea. But Rusty was already involved with a pretty controversial preacher, and every aspect of their relationship was being run through the street preacher and his wife. That man was Michael Peter Warrenecki, and his wife, Leslie Jean O'Colick. To give you a little background on these 2 clowns, the wife changed her name to Rachel Rebecca to distance herself from sinful modern ties. Together, they and their poor children would gather outside public events and churches, screaming that fire and brimstone would smite all that did not repent to their particular version of Christianity. Sell your earthly possessions, live off the land, and be humble. But give the money from those houses you sold to the Warrenecki family, because they were somehow more special than you. They believed that women's only place on the planet was to serve their fathers, and after they got married, their husbands. It is not a wife's duty to love her husband or expect happiness, they said. It is her duty to be a servant. So when Rusty and Andrea got married and announced the arrival of their first baby, they sought counsel from the Warreneckis first. Andrea, sweet, shy, and ever-obedient Andrea, was told that women who opted for medicated childbirth and cesareans were wicked. Women, they believed, were naturally sinful and needed to be humbled by the pain of childbirth. Using disposable diapers was a lazy cop-out. Cloth diapers needed to remind her that she was beneath her husband and her house. Also, birth control was equal to murder. The Lord would decide how many children to bless them with. Now, please understand me loud and clear. I am all for faith-based values, marriage, and all of those traditional concepts. Truly I am. But a fool that suggests that a woman and her unborn baby should die instead of accepting medical intervention or imply that someone is wicked for wanting to plan their family according to their capabilities and finances, well, that's not religion. That's insanity. When little Noah arrived in 1994, just a year after tying the knot, Rusty sold their house and moved his pregnant wife and their baby son out of Texas and into a trailer park in Florida. Why would a NASA engineer who made good money do that to a growing family? Well, because the Warreneckis preached that earthly possessions were prideful, remember? And Rusty wanted nothing more than to be just like the preacher that dressed his children in ridiculous bird costumes and made them dance on the sidewalks of college campuses. Warrenecki, his wife, and 6 children all lived in a traveling bus, and anyone who lived more comfortably than they were evil and prideful souls, doomed to burn in hell. Rusty already felt guilty for working an honest job, because according to Warrenecki, men who spent time working to provide for their families were going to go to hell too, because they should be spending their working hours praying instead of providing for their families. Andrea gave birth to their second son, John, in '95, while they lived in that cramped trailer. By the time Rusty's work in Florida ended and they went back to Texas, she was already pregnant with their third son, Paul. Instead of moving his wife and children back into the home they owned in Texas, Rusty sold their 5-bedroom house and pulled up that damn trailer into another trailer park so that they could continue to live like hermits. Andrea, who'd only ever known her childhood home, her demanding husband, and the teachings of the Warrenecki cult, was starting to crack under the pressure. She wrote to Rachel Warrenecki, telling her that she was lonely. The only other adults that she ever saw were her parents that she visited once a week. Her husband, when he wasn't at work, took off to play golf with friends. All she had was kids, laundry, and an impossibly small home that seemed to get more and more claustrophobic every year. Mrs. Warrenecki replied to her letter, only to tell Andrea that her complaints were proof of her naturally sinful nature. Andrea was selfish to expect more of her husband. It was her duty to birth babies and to serve the man of the house. Andrea withdrew into herself. Her mother became increasingly worried about her once bright and happy daughter that had suddenly become an exhausted shell of a woman who operated on autopilot. It's almost certain that Andrea was already suffering from postpartum depression by the time Paul came, but the Warreneckis' insistence that she was evil and her husband's increasing hold on the finances, her freedom, and their ever-worsening living arrangements forced Andrea to keep her darkening thoughts to herself for fear that those around her would judge and villainize her for simply feeling overwhelmed and isolated. The trailer park landlord reported that she'd never seen a more attentive mother than Andrea. She played with her boys, baked them elaborate cakes, and it seemed that she had an endless well of patience for their questions. The trailer was spotless, the yard well kept, and anyone looking in couldn't understand how Andrea was keeping it all so neat and orderly with so many kids in such a small space. Andrea almost only spoke of her children's milestones and marveled at how smart and adorable they were. Even though her situation was starting to weigh on her, Andrea never placed her needs above her husband and kids. I need to hone that truth down right now, because things are about to take a very dark turn. I need you to remember that Andrea was a good person, a good mother, and utterly devoted to being a good wife. The real Andrea and the thing she became later are two very different beings. If she was seen as a human being by those around her, then this terrible tragedy would never have happened. After a visit with the Warreneckis, Rusty sold their trailer and bought an even smaller one from the preacher. They were told that the fact that Rusty had the money in his bank account, for it meant that he was putting his career before God. They said that the boys, now age 5 and under, were misbehaved little delinquents that were proof of their parents' worldly ways. And that was all Andrea's fault. Her inability to control and run her household was going to doom them all to hell. But at least buy the Warreneckis' camper van, because giving money to such a devout family would give them some grace in the eyes of the Lord. Funny how everyone's going to hell unless they're giving the Warreneckis boatloads of cash, isn't it? They returned to Texas with an even smaller home on wheels, demands to homeschool their children, and sure that they were going to hell, thanks to Andrea's natural inclination to sin, and Andrea was pregnant yet again. Luke arrived into an impossibly small living situation in 1999. Her depression and overwhelmed state was getting so bad that Andrea reached out to Rachel Warrenecki again. This was Rachel's response. You must accept that this life is under the curse of sin and death. There is nothing in you and your emotions. You are a daughter of Eve. You must become a daughter of the Most High. 4 months later, Andrea called Rusty at work, begging him for help. He found her crouched in a corner of the van, shaking, crying, and pleading for help. He took her out for a walk, thinking that fresh air would cure her, but the next day, she tried to take her own life. Andrea was found by her mother, rushed to the hospital, and barely made it out alive. But at least for the first time in her young life, Rusty and the cult had no choice but to allow her to be taken to a hospital. Andrea was severely underweight on top of her fractured mental state. It didn't take long to diagnose her with postpartum depression. But Andrea refused to take the medication offered to her out of fear that her youngest son would be affected through her breast milk. The nurses were horrified to discover that she was convinced that she was going to be punished because the hospital visit was costing too much, despite the fact that they could afford a freaking private suite, and that the damage caused by the pills she had taken to end her own life could possibly have damaged her body. She was a vessel of childbearing, and if she had caused herself enough damage to be unable to bear more children, then she was surely going to be sent to hell. She was returned home, but everyone noticed that Andrea's behavior had taken a drastic turn. No more cakes, no more walks, no more games with the children. She started limiting the children's food, convinced that she was overfeeding them, that spoiling them with food would make them greedy. Andrea stopped eating and scratched her scalp until she was raw and had bald spots, because she believed the devil was possessing her and that the mark of the beast was under her hair. Her arms and her legs looked like she had been through a shredder. She heard voices from the TV telling her to kill her children, but she told no one about the devil's messages because she believed that if she spoke her fears out loud, it would manifest into truth. So she became completely mute instead. Everyone could clearly see that this woman was out of her mind. She'd stand in front of the TV listening to the devil for hours at a time, unmoving, so entranced that she drooled a pool of spit at her feet. Or she'd pace from morning to night until Rusty put her to bed. She wasn't taking the medication she was prescribed because the Warreneckis didn't believe in modern medication. Demons cause mental illness, and those could only be prayed and fasted away. The family were told by doctors that she needed to be kept under observation by someone at all times, so at least her mother and husband working in shifts could make sure that the kids were eating enough and being cared for. And that was Andrea's life. She'd go into full-blown psychosis, get so thin that she was medically in danger of dying, and then they'd drag her to a hospital, bodily loading her into a car. She'd get better, be discharged, throw her meds down the drain, and revert back to her catatonic state where hallucinations ruled her world. When Satan's commands became too hard to refuse, she'd try to take her own life again before she could hurt her kids.
She took a knife into her bathrobe.
She had a knife held up to her neck, and it's like she's looking at her neck trying to figure out how to cut herself so that she could successfully kill herself. And I said, "Give me the knife." And she said, "Let me do this." And I said, "No, give me the knife." She wouldn't do it. She just stood there like this. So I grabbed her arm and pulled it down, and I pried the knife out of her hand.
Then the vicious cycle of madness would start all over again. And every time, Rusty failed to take action. The doctors would request that he take medical authority over Andrea's care, which, as her husband, he had full legal right to do. The woman was near catatonic, for Pete's sake. She gnawed at her own fingers until she had no more nails left on her hands. How did he conceive that she was in any state to make decisions at all? But Rusty, probably afraid of God judging him for giving his wife medication, again refused to force her to get help. He said that she would have to do it herself, take responsibility for her own care, that any medical interventions would have to be her decision. Her mother, Judah, and Rusty's mother, Dora, took turns caring for the kids during the day until Rusty came home from work. It was Judah that finally took charge of the situation. She told Rusty to get his wife and their brood of kids out of that damn van and put them up in a proper house, which he did. It was still well below what he could actually afford and much smaller than the family needed, but at least they had 3 bedrooms and a decent bathroom now. After yet another hospital visit, things started looking up. Judah made sure Andrea drank her medication, and damn it, Andrea got better. The gnawing, scratching, and mutism went away. She played with her kids again, and she baked them cakes.
Within a day, Andrea went from being completely catatonic to sitting on the couch with me in the visiting area, and we carried on just, I referred to it as the best conversation we've ever had. The thing I learned from it is that she needed the right medicine. When I saw her respond to the medicine at that time, I'm like, wow, there's hope. There's hope that Andrea will return.
But after a year, she and Rusty convinced themselves that she was cured and no longer needed the meds. So she went off everything and promptly got pregnant again.
It was a particularly sweltering day in Houston, Texas, that Wednesday, the 18th of August, 1999. On the drive over to Dr. Eileen Starbranch's office, the radio weather commentator noted that despite being 96 degrees outside, it felt more like 105. Andrea had been quiet for most of the car ride, but there had been clear signs that she was starting to recover from her most recent mental breakdown. The night before, she and Rusty had been able to talk about her overall goals with the outpatient psychiatric treatment that she had been attending. Andrea Yates had been discharged from Memorial Springs Shadows Glen Psychiatric Hospital just 9 days earlier, her second inpatient psychiatric hospitalization in just the last 4 weeks. But this time around, Dr. Starbranch had diagnosed Andrea with postpartum depression, also known as PPD. However, her diagnosis also included PPD with psychotic features. In Andrea's first inpatient hospitalization, she had been diagnosed with depression and given the antidepressant Zoloft with Ativan for sleep. But neither drug had successfully helped mitigate the worsening symptoms that Andrea had continued to suffer since the onset of her condition over a month prior.
Little Mary Deborah Yates was born in 2000. Later that year, Andrea's father died of heart complications. With Judah now widowed and starting to feel her advanced age, she physically couldn't be as present for Andrea as she wanted to be anymore. Andrea's world collapsed around her in a fever dream of hallucinations and messages from the devil. All of her symptoms returned, with some additional new ones. She believed that her treatments were costing too much and that their utilities would be cut off as a result of her frivolous spending. So she kept the bath full of water just in case, stopped showering, and refused to put her new baby down. She also cleared the house of furniture and valuables. Since they were now living in an actual house, like a group of heathen, greedy monsters, she decided that God and the Warreneckis would forgive them if they only had the bare necessities. The next doctor saw Andrea, her head nearly bald, her nails chewed off and completely mute, and somehow decided that the Haldol that had always been sufficient to get her out of her psychosis was too strong. Instead, he wanted her off all medication completely. Rusty surprisingly put his foot down this time, insisting that medication was the only thing that had gotten her out of her comatose states before. He would not allow her to go home to the kids without it. Dr. Saeed did not put her on antipsychotics, however, despite the fact that Andrea had not eaten or spoken in 3 days, or that Saeed himself had classified her as catatonic, and he ignored the fact that Andrea was now so thin that her milk had dried up and her 6-month-old daughter could not eat. He put her on a microdose of anxiety medication and sent them all home. This bastard couldn't care less about his patient or the safety of her children. Her insurance wouldn't cover any more institutionalized time, so he wanted her out of there as fast as possible. To make things worse, the anti-anxieties that he gave her should never have been given to someone with schizophrenia or psychosis, as they can cause patient symptoms to worsen exponentially. As you can imagine, Andrea's condition did not change in the next 2 days. She didn't shower since her release, and she went right back to staring at the TV so that the devil could talk to her, completely oblivious to the existence of her children, mother, husband, and mother-in-law. Only little Mary, whom she'd held so tightly to her chest that the baby started to cry, was real to her. On the morning of June the 20th, 2000, Rusty had an important meeting at the NASA head office in Houston. He put a bowl of cereal in front of each child, gave Andrea her dangerous anti-anxiety meds, and left her to mindlessly pour the box of cereal out onto the counter at 9 a.m. His mother was scheduled to arrive in an hour to relieve him, but he was in a hurry and thought that Andrea and the kids would be okay for the next 60 minutes. He'd been leaving her alone with the kids for an hour or two at a time for the past 2 weeks, thoroughly convinced that it would improve her independence, as he told his golf buddies. He thought that all she needed was, and I quote, a good kick in the pants to get her out of it. Dora Yates, Rusty's mother, was in agreement with her son. Andrea needed to stop relying on people around her to do the bare minimum. When he left, Andrea put down the empty box of cereal, took her second oldest son Paul, and drowned him in the bathtub. She placed his body on her bed, walked back, and did the same with John, then Luke. When the 3 wet little bodies were lined up on the master bed, she turned to baby Mary, drowned her, and left her floating in the tub. 7-year-old Noah, the oldest, asked his mommy what was wrong with Mary. Andrea didn't answer him. Instead, she grabbed him and drowned him next to the lifeless body of his baby sister. Andrea did not make a sound throughout that 45 minutes. She picked up Mary, placed her inside John's arms, and left Noah in the bath. At 9:48, she called 911.
What's your name? Andrea Yates. What's the problem? I just need him to come. Is your husband there? No. Well, what's the problem? I need him to come. I need to know why we're coming, ma'am. Is he there standing next to you? She? Are you having a disturbance? Are you ill or what? Yes, I'm ill. You need an ambulance? No, I need a police officer. Well, send an ambulance.
2 officers were dispatched on what they thought was a domestic dispute. Next, she called Rusty at work and told him, in that same dead voice, to come home. When he asked her if anyone was hurt, she said yes, the kids. When he asked her who was hurt, she said, all of them, and then she hung up on him. The officers arrived first. Inside, they found a dark-haired woman, dripping wet, sitting on a couch. Andrea barely acknowledged the officers. They weren't even sure if she was aware that they were there at all.
She was on the couch, sitting on the couch, and I believe that officer had her in handcuffs, and she was just sitting on the couch, just kind of glaring at the wall, real like in a gaze, or haze, just like a little zombie, just had no clue what she did.
The whole scene was eerie. The house was as empty as it was quiet. Barely any furniture. The bedrooms he walked past had no bed frames, nightstands, or decorations, just plain mattresses on the floor. No pictures on the wall, and no toys either. The hallway was soaking wet as Andrea walked back and forth from the bathroom to master bedroom while she murdered her children. Inside the last bedroom lay 4 little bodies, eyes opened and soaked. Inside the bathtub lay the 5th child. All dead. The Yates boys and their long-awaited sister were gone, killed by their own mother, who was now unresponsive, staring at a blank TV, still listening to the devil, oblivious to her husband and mother-in-law screaming and crying outside, unaware that she was being handcuffed and put into a patrol car. At the station, Andrea waived her rights for a lawyer and calmly, in that monotone voice, confirmed that she had drowned her children. Police were wise enough to place her in psychiatric care. After just a day of being medicated properly, Andrea started talking to the doctors.
With police, Andrea said she killed her children because she was not a good mother. She told a county psychiatrist she wanted to save them from Satan.
Why would Satan want you to do something that saved the children?
Scared.
Because the act would condemn you.
As you can see, it was an arduous process. She took half a minute to respond to a question, and that's on the rare occasions that she was somewhat lucid, or else she'd stare at the light fixtures. She was so out of it that she needed assistance to use the bathroom. When they asked her why, Andrea told them that she was a bad mother. Because of her, the kids were underdeveloped, and the CIA were watching the house to arrest her for failing to raise good, God-fearing children. The demons in the walls and the TV were in the house to take their sinful little souls. If the government weren't going to take them to put them into wicked public schools, then her bad parenting was going to doom them all to hell. All Andrea could do was to kill them while they were still young enough for God to allow them into heaven. And now that she was incarcerated, Governor George Bush would have to go after the devil for her. Just FYI, Bush was no longer governor when she said this. He'd been president for well over a year by then. Andrea's sense of time was just as warped as her mind was. Now, all of you must realize that Andrea Yates cannot possibly be held fully responsible for her actions. This woman had been trapped inside her mind for the past 7 years. That horror world inside her head was real, and everything outside of it was not. Like the cases of Kai the Hitchhiker and DeCarlos Brown Jr. that we covered before on this channel, we have an individual who was so clearly mentally ill that they should never have been out of institutionalized care. Andrea tried to take her own life twice, desperate to die instead of hurting her children. She begged for help multiple times. Her doctors all warned not to leave her alone with the kids. They advised that she be institutionalized, that she not have more children. Before Dr. Said, every single doctor did everything right. The only one in her life who tried their hardest to manage Andrea's condition was her elderly mother, Judah.
I want to know why nobody was there with Andrea.
But Rusty, with the mad cult's words in his ears, refused to take his wife's well-being seriously. He did not take responsibility for her when she was in no condition to do it herself, and he left his kids in her care when he knew that she was a danger to them, that hallucinations were telling her to kill them. Rusty wasn't domineering or overbearing. He was just plain spineless, too afraid to take charge and possibly just as delusional as his mentally ill wife. Rusty remained convinced that his wife would be found innocent and even told their lawyers that after she was set free, they were going to have more children. I'm not even joking. Rusty was still of the belief that it was her duty to have babies. You can blame the Warreneckis and their insane teachings all you want, but at the end of the day, the people who chose to listen to them made the choice to do so. By doing nothing, Rusty thought he'd absolve himself of sin, when in truth, his lack of action is as much to blame for the tragic loss of 5 little kids' lives as Andrea's demons are. The courts did the right thing for once. Unlike Kyle and DeCarlos Brown, she was found not guilty by reason of insanity and sentenced to a mental institution. This is remarkable. The public and the defense were demanding the death penalty. Making this decision could have cost the judge his job and probably his life. A child killer is one thing, but a mother who killed her 5 babies, well, the public doesn't just forget that overnight. Hell, Andrea took so long to get out of her psychotic state, even with enough Haldol in her system to tranquilize a horse, she wasn't even fit to stand trial. Dr. Said, who refused her the proper medication and gave her the dangerous anti-anxiety med, was absolved of any wrongdoing. Rusty, who claimed not to know about her hallucinations, even though it was recorded by doctors for years before the murders, was found not liable. And the Warreneckis, who'd only written to Andrea until their 3rd son was born, were not considered liable for any wrongdoing either. Rusty divorced Andrea, remarried, and had more kids. The only silver lining here is that the wife left him after only 3 years of marriage. Andrea's had the opportunity to apply for parole multiple times, but even after 20 years, she has not applied for it once. Andrea had reportedly said that she feels safe behind those gray walls, where doctors can make sure that she takes the medication that her demons would otherwise refuse her to take. Without her kids, there is nothing out there in the world to return to. And when she's lucid, Andrea realizes that she needs to be punished for the terrible, terrible thing that she did, even if she now has no memory of that day at all. She's 62 years old and spends her time re-watching home videos and making birthday cards for her children. She's made it clear that no matter how many times parole is on the table, she won't take it. Andrea will die behind those walls where she and everyone else is safe from her demons. I hate cases like this, where there isn't just a victim and a perpetrator, a clear line in the sand between good and evil. Andrea Yates killed her babies, all 5 of them. She is a murderer. That much is clear. But for 7 years, she pleaded for help. She even tried to kill herself instead of hurting her kids. She scratched her hair out of her head, gnawed on her fingers, starved herself, went completely silent. Even with those blaring red flags, everyone in her life decided not to save Andrea from herself and her children. Her husband, her mother-in-law, her religious advisors, and, by the end, even her own doctor, all deserve to pay the price for their sins too. Yet, they're allowed to live and be happy while Andrea drowns in the horror of what she's done. She was insane, will always be insane, and she'll always be a child killer. But what about the people who could have stepped in and saved those babies? Yet again, I leave you with a bitter taste in my mouth, and that now familiar feeling of injustice and loss. How do you feel about it? You know what to do. Leave your thoughts down below. Leave a like, subscribe, and join me in Nightmare Land, 'cause I'm definitely not sleeping good tonight. See you in the next one, people.